You know, when we look across the prison population, it's exploded over the last several decades. And one of the things we continue to hear from black leadership is that the laws are disproportionate towards black drug offenders. What we haven't heard is that our black leadership actually asks for stiffer penalties for blacks for the use of crack and heroin. And it goes all the way back to the 60s. You know, Jesse Jackson and the Congressional Black Caucus went to Congress to do something about the inner city crack trade and its attendant violence. You know, Congress acted, and all of a sudden when blacks got busted at higher rates than whites for crack possession versus cocaine, powdered cocaine, all of a sudden it became a human rights issue. You know, in the 1980s, many critics of the American criminal justice system complained that the penalties for possession of crack cocaine, which is mostly used by blacks, were much harsher than the penalties for possession of powder cocaine. And basically, the users of powder cocaine are affluent white people. You know, and what we keep hearing is the reason the penalties are so different is because of racism. You know, everything gets blamed on racism. Everything gets blamed on slavery. You know, one of the things we need to understand is that it wasn't racism that caused the disparity. You know, if we go and check the congressional record, it shows in 1986 when the federal anti-crack legislation was first being debated, the Congressional Black Caucus but showed or acted like they were deeply concerned about the degree that crack was decimating black communities across the United States. And they actually strongly supported the legislation, and they actually pressed for harsher penalties. You know, a few years earlier, the Congressional Black Caucus actually pressured Ronald Reagan to create the Office of the National Drug Control Policy. You know, the vast majority of cocaine and the rest are made at the state level, not the federal level. In reality, only 13 states punish crack convictions more harshly than cocaine powder convictions. Drug possession accounts for fewer than 2% of all the offenses that propel individuals in the federal prisons. Those most likely to be incarcerated for drug convictions are not mere users, but traffickers who are largely career criminals with very long rap sheets. I mean, think about, you know, the bounty they put on Noriega's head years ago, you know, just to get an idea of what happens at the federal level. You know, it's also noteworthy to note that the critics of the crack versus powder penalty gap generally view the alleged injustice solely from the criminal's perspective. You know, criminals never wrong, are they? They ignore the fact that the harsher punishment for crack harm only a small subset of the black population, normally drug dealers and users, and they actually benefit the rest of the community. You know, some of the folks that push for stiffer penalties were people that we honor and revere in the black community. Ozzie Davis, Dick Gregory, Charles Rangel, Reverend Wendell Foster, Jesse Jackson, Dwight Muhammad, Kwawi, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, Walter Fauntroy, Hosea Williams, Ishmael Reed, you know, John Johnson from Ebony Magazine, the civil rights icon Dorothy Height, who actually received an award about 11 years ago, Shirley Chisholm, we all love Shirley, Robert Nix Sr., and Senator Edward Brooke. You know, Charlie Rangel published an op-ed piece in the New York Times titled "Legalize Drugs, Not on Your Life." He actually chastised Ronald Reagan for not doing enough to battle the illegal narcotics and caused crack the worst epidemic in our history. Jesse Jackson suggested that the federal government hasn't made a sincere effort to stop the drug trade. We must end the scourge on American culture, he said. Some of the representatives approved the Anti-Drug Control Act of 1988, which was a bipartisan bill which further toughens narcotic penalties. They actually added the death penalty in certain cases. And they created the Office of National Drug Control Policy, establishing a so-called drug czar, and czar is a term that's thrown out there quite a bit now, but they established a drug czar for the first time, and it actually enabled a federal media campaign designed to curtail youth substance abuse. This passed the House by a vote of 346 to 11. And I remember when Bill Clinton was in office, he had appointed former police chief Lee Brown to be his drug czar. A lot of African American House members didn't even vote on the measure, but Julian Dixon, William Gray, August Hawkins, and Charlie Rangel voted in favor for the bill. The only African American no votes were cast by John Lewis and John Conyers. And in Ebony magazine, they actually published an article describing Charlie Rangel as the frontline general in the war on drugs. Charles Rangel talked about the cancerous epidemic of drugs hitting the black communities in America. He actually chastised George H.W. Bush for not doing enough to stop drugs. He blasted the White House for moving with turtle-like speed to tackle narcotics. He actually published a memoir acknowledging that he partnered with Richard Nixon to launch the U.S. drug war. See, you have to think back, when was Nixon in office? Those laws have actually been described by many critics as oppressive, racist, and even genocidal. Comparable to the European Holocaust, to slavery, and to the Jim Crow segregation laws in the South. But one thing we haven't been told is that our current war on drugs was established at a time of growing African American political power. Many of the toughest crime laws were crafted based on ideas and political mobilization that came from the black community itself. In 1968 in Harlem, Reverend Oberia Dempsey recruited volunteers from among retired policemen, guards, and others who had been trained and held pistol permits in order to patrol local streets and break up drug activity. This was according to the New York Times. In 1968, Dempsey published an op-ed in Harlem's Amsterdam News, which was a black newspaper, calling on local blacks to please join the war on dope. In a sermon broadcast that year, he argued that the greatest challenge facing America is not North Vietnam. The greatest challenge facing America is crime. In 1969, after a clinical study offers evidence that large numbers of Washington, D.C. jail inmates have heroin in their bloodstream, the city's black mayor, Walter Washington, allows Pioneer Methadone Treatment Program. Richard Nixon embraces the program, and backers of the program cite evidence that drug therapy program cuts crime in half, but suspicion runs high in the black community. It was enslaving the black underclass, says Dr. Robert DuPont, the founder of the study, citing rumors coming at the time during the interview with PBS. The Nixon administration is considering reduced penalties for marijuana possession, along with more education in an effort to convince young people to avoid experimenting with still stronger drugs. And in June of 1970, Ebony magazine published an article titled "Blacks Declare War on Dope." And in that article it says, most community groups agree that the first offensive must be against black pushers and distributors, who, as one father of a 19-year-old addict says, come brazenly into our neighborhoods and murder and cripple our children with that junk. The article argues, noting that a year earlier, 224 New York City teenagers died from heroin overdoses or drug-related infections. Shirley Chisholm is actually quoted describing the drug epidemic in her district as comparable to the bubonic plague. In February of 1971, The Congressional Black Caucus, founded on a motion by Charles Rangel, and according to historian Marguerite Ross Barnett, the group quickly made a transformation from a small, relatively powerless, and ignored group of representatives to a national synosia. Through most of its history, the CBC would advocate actively for tough drug war legislation. On March 25, 1971, the Congressional Black Caucus, and I'm going to refer to them as the CBC for the rest of this talk, they secured a closed-door sit-down meeting with Richard Nixon in the cabinet room. During this session, the group demands more action to stop the flow of narcotics into urban neighborhoods. Members acknowledge that they are risking their credibility meeting with Nixon. The session is secretly recorded by Nixon. Charles Rangel, a newly elected Democrat from New York City and a former federal prosecutor, urges Nixon to do more to fight drugs without waiting for further congressional action, warning that support might soon bill for drug legalization. You do have the power, and we implore you to use it as you would if this were a national crisis, and I think we've reached that point, Charlie Rangel insisted. Before departing, the Black Caucus presented Nixon with a manifesto of 60 priorities for the black community. It included the demand that drug abuse and addiction be declared a major national crisis and a call to use all existing resources to stop the trafficking of drugs. And on June 17, 1971, Richard Nixon takes to the airwaves to declare a war on drugs. At times he seems to echo Charlie Rangel's words from the March meeting. Listen to Nixon. Public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse, he says solemnly. In order to defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new, all-out offensive. However, we never heard Rangel say these words because we blamed it all on Richard Nixon. And we're still doing that today. On March 22nd, 1972, Nixon had a Schaefer Commission. And it was made largely of conservative white elected officials, which recommended the legalization of marijuana. Neither the marijuana user nor the drug itself can say it to constitute a danger to public safety, writes co-author Governor Raymond Schaefer, a Republican from Pennsylvania. Measure receives no support from black lawmakers in Congress. You know, when we think about it, you know, we talk about marijuana, and you know, most of those that smoke marijuana, they not gonna cause traffic accidents because they're sitting at the stop sign waiting for it to turn green. In January of 1973, and see, this is where all of the backlash stems from. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a longtime member of the NAACP, hello, with close ties to the black community, hello, rolls out drug laws that will set a new standard for tough sentences, even for low-level, non-violent drug offenders. I have one goal and one objective, and that is to stop the pushing of drugs and to protect the innocent victim, Rockefeller declared at a press conference. He is joined at the podium by prominent black leaders from New York City who support the measure, and they urge Rockefeller to adopt even more stringent penalties, including the death penalty for pushers. Glester Hines, who led an organization in Harlem called the People's Civic and Welfare Association, even said, "Our young people are dying, they're being destroyed. And unless you back this bill, New York State is doomed." And not only the state of New York, but all the other states are watching to see what New York is doing. And on August 21st, 1974, the CBC meets with Gerald Ford at Ford's request. During this meeting, Representative Charles Diggs lauded the appointment of New York Governor Rockefeller to serve as Ford's vice president. In 1976, California's Democratic legislature passes and liberal Democratic Governor Jerry Brown signs SB 42, establishing tough new mandatory minimum sentencing laws comparable to those approved by New York State 3 years earlier. And according to a RAND study, the law produces prison commitment rates in California that have increased substantially, contributing to a major problem of prison crowding. August 2nd, 1977, President Jimmy Carter proposes easing federal marijuana laws. The measure fails to find support in democratically controlled Congress. And see, we want to keep blaming Republicans for everything. Jimmy Carter couldn't even get support of the Democratic Party. I support legislation amending the federal law to eliminate all federal criminal penalties for the possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana. This decriminalization is not legalization. It means only that the federal penalty for possession would be reduced and a person would receive a fine rather than a criminal penalty. Federal penalties for trafficking will remain in force, and the states will remain free to adopt whatever laws they wish concerning the marijuana smoker. And you know, California's Democratic Party approved a second measure in 1978 toughening incarceration and parole rules, and it was called a Public Protection Bill. Governor Brown once again signs the measure into law. In a press statement, he boasts that for the most crimes, the bill triples the maximum period a person released from state prison can be placed on parole and subjected to conditions of parole and supervision by a parole officer. You know, Nancy Reagan started her national campaign, Just Say No, in 1982, which was designed to inoculate young people against the temptations of drugs. You know, the program is actually criticized by some within the black community as unrealistic and naive. But thousands of community and school-based programs form, and Just Say No is popularized by black leadership and entertainers including Michael Jackson. You know, Congressional Black Caucus, the CBC, releases the Black Leadership Plan for the Unity, Survival, and Progress of Black People in 1982, February 1982. And the document was penned by Walter Fontroy once again, and it included criticism that the diminished drug enforcement increases vulnerability to drug abuse for black youth. You know, the document actually complained about police brutality and warned that the incident of crime in black communities is increasing because of intentional and unintentional failure on the part of law enforcement agencies to provide adequate protection. The plan also urged the police to increase drug enforcement efforts and include community sources of information and cooperation. Ronald Reagan actually signed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 on October 12. It actually created tougher penalties for marijuana possession. It also created a new federal sentencing commission. And I know what you're saying, you know, you're talking about the Democratic Party, and now here you go with Ronald Reagan signing a bill into law, and he's a Republican. Well, get this. The bill was proposed by Ted Kennedy. The measure actually passed with overwhelming margins in the House and the Senate. On July 15, 1986, Walter Fontroy testified before a committee hearing describing crack cocaine as the plague. Every area of our life, every institution of our society is being affected by this tragedy and high cost of drug abuse, he said. Fontroy actually laments the fact that prisons are clogged with drug offenders and cites a study suggesting that 65% of the persons arrested at the present time have some form of illegal drug in their system. Drugs, and now crack, are indeed the source of threat to all civilized society, and each of us must accept 100% of the responsibility for eliminating this threat in our midst. He concluded, describing the drug war as a terrible struggle. You know, Ossie Davis joined street vigils in July of 1986 against the crack epidemic. And it was actually organized by leaders of 60 black churches. Just as in the past we fought slavery, we fought racism, we're going to fight drugs and the total indifference of those in power. is what Isaac Davis says. New York City Councilman Wendell Foster tells a gathering of 200 people that drugs are a new form of genocide for the black community. As devastating as drugs may be in the white community, they are 10 times worse in the black community, Foster declared. New York Democratic Governor Mario Cuomo introduces sweeping drug war legislation that escalates Rockefeller-era penalties, particularly for crack cocaine, in August of 1986. Governor Cuomo's proposal last week for penalties of up to life in prison for drug dealers convicted of selling even a small amount of crack, 3 vials, or $50, has renewed a 2-decade-old debate in New York State, the New York Times reports. Do severe penalties reduce drug dealing, or are they political responses to appease an outraged public? Public pressure in support of the measure is intense. I've never seen anything like it, said District Attorney Mario Marola of the Bronx. Hardly a week goes by that we don't have an anti-crack rally in the Bronx. In October of 1986, the major federal drug war legislation passed. It's called the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. It passes Congress. It enacts far tougher federal mandatory minimum sentencing laws for drug offenders, including those caught with just marijuana. It actually established a 100-to-1 disparity in punishments for crack cocaine compared with the powder form of the drug. This measure is supported by the CBC, although some members want even harsher penalties. Did you hear that? They want even harsher penalties for drug crimes. 16 of the 19 black members of the House, including Mickey Leland at the time, and Ron Dellums, co-sponsored the bill. Concerned about the spiraling cost of the drug war, in January of 1987, Ronald Reagan proposes significant cuts to spending on interdiction and treatment efforts. The measure draws fierce criticism from Charles Rangel. Just let that sink in for a minute. The Republican president wanted to cut funding for all of the money that's being spent on the drug war, and one of the black Democratic leaders blasting him for wanting to do so. On March 5th, 1987, veteran civil rights activists began a political fast to demand federal action to slow illegal drug use. This is according to the Associated Press. 2 veteran civil rights activists have begun a 40-day fast to protest drug abuse. The Reverend Hosea Williams and Dick Gregory, the comedian, camped out at the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s grave and said they plan to spend 2 days each outside the White House, the United States Capitol, and the New York Stock Exchange. The 2 men said they would send a telegram to Ronald Reagan asking him to commit more federal money to fight against drug abuse. And you see, Michael Jackson wasn't the only Jackson to support federal efforts against drugs. LaToya Jackson actually became a spokesperson for the federal war on drugs. She actually made a single, Just Say No. And it begins with a warning that people are dying because of drugs. On May 17, 1988, Charles Rangel published an op-ed piece in the New York Times titled, Legalize Drugs, Not on Your Life. He actually chastised Reagan for not doing enough to battle illegal narcotics and called crack the worst epidemic in our history. See, and that's the problem. We keep running to the government to solve everything. How about they take action in their own communities and get some men in the communities and fight this stuff instead of waiting on the government, to come in and handle that stuff. We're always waiting for the government to do something we need to be doing. Now, I'm not saying being vigilantes or anything like that. I'm just saying, hey, you spot a problem, let the law enforcement know. Stop waiting for all the federal people in charge to come take care of things. Charles Reagan said, here we are talking about legalization, and we have yet to come up with any formal national strategy or any commitment from the administration on fighting drugs beyond mere words. We have never fought the war on drugs like we have fought other legitimate wars with all the forces at our command. Now let that sink in for a minute. if we fought the war on drugs like we fought the rest of the wars, like Vietnam, Korea, World War II, and the war on drugs was fought in the black community the same way, what kind of backlash you think we'd get out of that? When Jesse Jackson ran for president in '88, he gave a speech at the Democratic National Convention in Atlanta, and he actually called for a real war on drugs, demanding reform to interdiction efforts. You can't just say no. Jackson tells Democrats, you can't just say no. Oh, everything is a choice. You can say no. He actually suggests that bankers and other high-placed individuals are enabling the drug trade, and he actually blames the drug epidemic on poverty. Some of us take drugs as anesthesia for our pain. You know, the problem with that is I know a lot of people that came up in poverty and didn't choose to do drugs. You know, Jackson actually suggested that the federal government hasn't made a sincere effort to stop the drug trade. We must end the scourge on American culture, he says. And see, we keep hearing this stuff, and more blacks are disproportionately locked up, more of us commit crime. I'm sick and tired of it. Stop committing crime. Nobody forced you to commit crime. I grew up in a black community, and a lot of guys I grew up with chose to commit crimes. And these guys came from a female-headed home, and these guys came from two-parent-headed homes. I also came up with guys who never did any crime. These guys came up in a female-headed home, and these guys came up in two-parent-headed home. So it's a choice. On October 22nd, 1988, the House of Representatives approved the Anti-Drug Control Act. It was a bipartisan bill which further toughened narcotics penalties, adding a death penalty in certain cases and creating the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And, I've mentioned that already. But, a lot of blacks didn't support that bill because they actually understood the long-term effects, which is what we're seeing right now. Ronald Reagan didn't sign the bill until November 18th of that year. And this is what Charles Rangel said. Now Congress and the American people will know who is in charge of dealing with the nation's drug crisis, because this individual will be responsible full-time for developing and coordinating all aspects of our war on drugs. And in 1989, Ishmael Reed, who was a poet and essayist, he actually published an essay titled Ground Zero about life in a drug-racked neighborhood, portraying pushers and dealers as black terrorists and crack fascists. Ebony magazine in 1989 March of 1989 published an article describing Charles Rangel as the frontline general in the war on drugs. Charles Rangel talks about the cancerous epidemic of drugs hitting black communities in America. Rangel actually chastised the administration of George H.W. Bush for not doing enough to stop drugs. We need outrage, Rangel says. I don't know what is behind the lackadaisical attitude toward drugs, but I do know that the American people have made it abundantly clear. They are outraged by the indifference of the U.S. government to this problem. And once again, it's the government's problem. It's never a community problem. On the cover of Ebony magazine, the August 1989 issue, the front cover of their magazine, the issue was War, the Drug Crisis. That was the front cover. The drug crisis in black America has become a deadly, uncontrolled plague that has turned some neighborhoods into war zones. In a letter to readers, publisher John Johnson describes the coverage as one of the most important issues we've published. According to the article, a deadly plague rages in the streets of black communities. Charles Rangel insists in a televised debate in 1991 that the drug war should continue, in a debate with conservative William F. Buckley Jr. And William Buckley wanted drugs legalized. And Buckley said what do you want to do with the 800,000 people that you convict? Do you want to torture them to death? He argues that the drug war is leading to 800 deaths per day. Rangel actually acknowledged that the criminal justice system has not worked and has been a deterrent to drug abuse in this country. But Rangel goes on to insist, I still believe that it should be there, and he actually argued against legalization. He argues that someone like Colin Powell should be placed in charge of the effort. Now, pay attention to what I just said. Rangel is slightly changing his position, but he does call for even more criminalization efforts. You know, in order to fight this war, you need all of these factors working together. You should not allow people to distribute this poison without fear that they could be arrested and put in jail, Charles Rangel says. You know, and under y'all's first black president in 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act passed as democratically controlled Congress with overwhelming margins based on Democratic support with significant Republican opposition. And the Republicans actually opposed gun control measures within the bill as well. Major backers of this bill include Senate Judiciary Chairman Joe Biden, your current VP, and New York Senator Charles Schumer. Measure is supported by the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. The goal is to expand staffing with 100,000 new recruits nationwide. This actually establishes the 3 strikes and you're out sentencing rules. Your first black president. This expands the death penalty to include drug trafficking crimes and also eliminates federal funding for inmate education programs. See, Bill Clinton didn't even want to help them once they got locked up. He wanted to make sure they stayed there. This bill also allocated $9.8 billion with a B in federal funds for construction of state prisons nationwide. Gangs and drugs have taken over our streets and undermined our schools, Clinton argues, claiming that the law will help fund enough prisons to keep 100,000 criminals off the street. Yeah, check those numbers from the time he entered office on the prison population. In 1997, Maxine Waters was elected the chair of the CBC, and she actually pushed for hearings into rumors that the U.S. government and the CIA have cultivated the drug trade, harming a black neighborhood. Mandatory minimum prison sentences interfere with judicial authority and impose one-size-fits-all penalties without considering specific circumstances, Waters says. In addition, mandatory minimum sentences, especially those related to drug possession and laws that impose more severe penalties for crack cocaine and powder cocaine, have resulted in the incarceration of a disproportionate amount of African Americans. Now, do you hear Waters' position? Yes, there's evidence of drug trafficking. Yes, it was predominantly in black neighborhoods. But since black leadership were the ones calling for and had been calling for locking up blacks for drugs, why would you place the drugs anywhere else for distribution if you know that because of black leadership you can lock up the people who are pushing the drugs for you? The black leadership created this problem, as usual. In 1998, Charles Rangel published an article in a journal called Criminal Justice Ethics, arguing that against drug legalization and claiming that legalization of drugs would be a nightmare in minority communities. In my view, the very idea of legalizing drugs in this country is counterproductive. Many well-meaning drug legalization advocates disagree with me, but their arguments are not convincing. They disagreed, so they wasn't convincing. The questions that I asked them 20 years ago remain unanswered. Would all drugs be legalized? If not, why? Would consumers be allowed to purchase an unlimited supply? Are we prepared to pay the medical costs for illnesses that are spawned by excessive drug use? Well, we got Obamacare. Who would be allowed to sell drugs? Would an illegal market still exist? Would surgeons, bus drivers, teachers, military personnel, engineers, and airline pilots be allowed to use drugs? And see, I think that's just getting too extreme with it. I mean, if you apply for a job today, you have to take a drug test. If you play football at the college and professional level, you have to take drug tests. I mean, in some situations, even in high schools, they make you take drug tests. And even after getting hired, some might, if they feel like something is wrong, it's in your contract in most cases where they can do random drug tests. So, I mean, that argument is not even valid. On March 26, 2003, Hillary Clinton, who was a senator up in New York at the time, and other top officials, they gathered in Washington to honor civil rights icon Dorothy Height. The former ally of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is praised for a wide range of accomplishments, one of which is having led numerous campaigns for the war on drugs. According to the YWCA, where Height worked in Harlem and New York City, she advocated in the war on drugs. Charles Rangel published a memoir in November of 2007, acknowledging that he partnered with President Nixon to launch the U.S. drug war. Oh, now he come out and say it. But Nixon was tough on drugs, Rangel recalls. We worked closely together on what was the beginning of our international war on drugs. The national passion behind the war against drugs, I'm sorry to say, has faded. It hit its high point somewhere in Ronald Reagan's presidency during the crack epidemic and has since petered out. We never did win the war, of course. Yeah, that's because he was fighting it the wrong way. In January of 2008, in an interview with Ebony magazine, Barack Obama, who was a presidential candidate at the time, promised to review these mandatory minimum sentences to see where we can be smarter on crime and reduce the blind and counterproductive warehousing of nonviolent offenders. I will also eliminate the disparity between sentencing for crack and powder cocaine, Obama said. And on February 25, 2009, Attorney General Eric Holder, the first black to hold that spot, prosecutes the drug war aggressively. On February 25th, less than 3 weeks after taking office, he announced his major drug-related arrest. We simply cannot afford to let down our guard, Holder says. These drug cartels will be destroyed. Kind of funny since he continued a program that had been going on for years, called the Fast and the Furious, where he was giving guns to the drug cartels. In 2010, Michelle Alexander published a book titled The New Jim Crow. This book actually portrayed the drug war as a deliberate political attack on blacks, an effort to replace Jim Crow-style segregation laws with biased criminal justice laws. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all practices we supposedly left behind, Alexander argues. In her book, Alexander is critical of black lawmakers, civil rights leaders, and others who supported the drug war. Alexander said, the fact that some black people endorse harsh responses to crime is best understood as a form of complicity with mass incarceration, not support of it. Not support for it. And on February 2nd, 2010, Barack Obama appoints Bush-era appointee Michelle Leonhardt, a longtime opponent of marijuana legalization, to head the DEA. Leonhardt has confirmed and serves in the post despite criticism from pro-legislation groups. And Neil Franklin, in 2010, he's the black American head of law enforcement against prohibition. He supported Proposition 19 in California, which was a referendum to legalize marijuana. And on July 19, 2010, black leaders in California line up on both sides of California's Proposition 19 and a referendum to legalize marijuana. And Dr. Jocelyn Elders, who was a former Surgeon General who happened to be black, supports legalization. But according to the New York Times, Kamala Harris, the DA over in San Francisco, who happens to be black, joined the opposition. Ms. Harris issued a statement saying that the proposition would encourage driving while high and drugs in the workplace. Well, I've already addressed that. Somebody who's driving high on marijuana, they sitting at the stop sign waiting for it to turn green. And, I've seen people, I know people personally who actually do drugs, who sell drugs, and I've never seen them operate a motor vehicle like someone who's impaired by alcohol. No, I'm sorry. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying I've never seen them driving impaired for the most part. On July 28, 2010, black leaders in California acknowledged deep divide in views about marijuana legalization. Some black church leaders called for the state's NAACP chief, Alice Huffman, to resign for her support of legalization. According to the NPR, the NAACP supports the decriminalization as a strategy to keep more young black men out of jail. And on October 16, 2010, Eric Holder signaled strong opposition to Proposition 19. In a public letter, Holder urges rejection of the measure, promising that the Obama administration will continue to vigorously prosecute federal marijuana possession cases. Let me state clearly that the Department of Justice strongly opposes Proposition 19. If passed, this legislation will greatly complicate federal drug enforcement efforts to the detriment of our citizens. In a major reversal, Charles Rangel co-sponsored the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act of 2011, a bill that will remove marijuana from the list of illegal drugs under the Controlled Substances Act. The measure also draws support from Rep. John Conyers, who was actually the head of the CBC at the time, and the measure fails. And in 2012, a lot of people complain about this guy. He's from down here in Texas itself, down in the Lake Jackson area. But Ron Paul actually called for an end to the drug war. And I know many people have issues with evangelist Pat Robertson, but even he said to legalize marijuana. In March of 2012, he even said we're locking up people who are taking a couple of puffs of marijuana. Robertson might be taking a couple of puffs himself. We've got to take a look at what we're considering crimes. I'm not exactly for the use of drugs, don't get me wrong, but incarcerating marijuana users is costing us a fortune and ruining young people. Now, The Root actually published an article calling for black pastors to follow Robertson's lead. The question is, writes journalist Madison Gray, why haven't black preachers spoke out against drug laws that hurt our community? And that's not just drugs. Why won't black pastors speak out about anything that harms our community? Only thing a lot of them talking about is how good they suit look, or let's put more money into the plate for our visiting pastor. They're not addressing the drug problem. They're not addressing the illegitimate birth problem. They're not addressing the abortion problem. They're not addressing the homosexual problem. They're not addressing the black-on-black crime problem. They're not addressing the non-commitment of people to be married before they have kids problem. They're not addressing nothing. But they say they love that book, and they say they love the Lord, but they ain't addressing nothing out of the book. Even MSNBC on April 16, 2012, their commentators urged Barack Obama to follow Libertarian Ron Paul's lead on drug war policy. And in February of 2013, the Ending Federal Marijuana Prohibition Act was introduced, and it called for marijuana to be regulated in the same way that U.S. government treats alcohol. Charles Rangel and John Conyers are not included as co-sponsors. And we all know about the racial disparity regarding incarceration, and that disproportionately impact African Americans, especially males, and how most of the crimes are economic in nature and based on a small amount of cocaine or marijuana. Even Republican-led states like Georgia are trying to respond to this issue. The governor of Georgia, Nathan Deal, is trying to reduce state correctional spending by softening sentencing laws. The GOP-led House of Representatives over there introduced legislation that calls for special courts to steer drug users into rehab, which Deal says is cheaper than a jail sentence. Georgia actually has the nation's highest rate of correctional control, with 1 in 13 residents locked up on probation or parole. and it spends 7% of its almost $16 billion budget on prisons. Although many states are following Georgia's lead, the Obama administration is not, and instead is increasing the funding of federal prisons. According to an analysis by the Federal Times, the Bureau of Prisons is seeking a 4.2% increase, and I actually believe a 4.2% increase might be a couple of years old, one of the largest of any federal agency, which would bring its total budget to more than $6.9 billion. You know, and actually, according to Obama's budget, 4 new federal prisons will open, including in Mississippi and West Virginia. You know, although while he was on the campaign trail, fundraising in New York in 2007, November, Obama said, I don't want to wake up 4 years from now and discover that we still have more young black men in prison than in college, which is a false stat anyway. If you actually check out those numbers, you actually see it's more black men in college than it is in prison. But we hear something long enough, it actually becomes true in our minds. It seems the president's policy of increasing prison funding will more likely ensure more young black males are incarcerated than less. Before he announced his resignation, Eric Holder called for federal drug laws to be reformed or repealed. And he said we need to ensure that incarceration is used to punish, deter, and rehabilitate, not merely to convict, warehouse, and forget. You know, those were his prepared statements. But it seemed to fly in opposition to what his former boss wanted.